Hello, welcome to Chapter 4 of the Human Sexuality textbook for FCS 3800. This is Dr. Moyer as usual. We will be looking at sexual identity development, sex versus gender, the genetic determination of one's biological sex, genetic disorders, and sexual orientation. One thing that I should warn you about when it comes to sexual identity before we get into tonight's PowerPoint, our culture, our American culture, has forced a dichotomous view of sexual identity. So a person is supposed to identify as either male or female, homosexual or heterosexual, masculine or feminine. But research shows us that it's actually more realistic to think of these topics as a continuum rather than a dichotomy, and that people can range on the continuum and do, and very rarely are exclusively on one end or the other. And so a male may have some female characteristics, for example, or a female may have some masculine characteristics. And we know there's not just two sexual orientation categories, heterosexual or homosexual, there are actually many. So try to force your brain to move away from the dichotomy and try to embrace the continuum. The idea that people, their sexuality is on a line and they fall somewhere either towards one end or the other or somewhere in the middle. One thing that's confusing is that there's this idea that people just magically evolve into healthy, self-accepting sexual beings. That's just not true. Our culture has narrowly defined what is acceptable when it comes to sexuality, and this is very obvious if you examine images through the media and listen to messages. So being heterosexual, being attractive, being able-bodied, and being young is what is considered desirable in our society. But this is not true, as it leaves out a lot of other individuals, a lot. And that people have different attractions for different reasons. And really the truth is we can't explain what we're attracted to, we just are. And in order to be sexually healthy, we have to do three things. We have to examine our past, we have to look for explanations and answers, and we have to work through different aspects of our sexual identity that may be uncomfortable for us. For example, you may have difficulties getting close to others. Maybe you don't like to be touched. Maybe you have trouble making commitments. Or maybe you have issues with arousal. So it's important not only to find the explanations and answers for why this has occurred, but also to embrace it and try to accommodate just the way you are and work through it if at all possible. When we're talking about, I've mentioned this in our very first PowerPoint, when we're talking about sex, we actually have two definitions. But really, not only is it a biological category and it refers to the human anatomy, but it's also a verb and can refer to the sexual act. Right now, I want you to think about sex as a biological category only, and forget the verb of intercourse, and gender as a socially constructed category, because we actually learn how to be male or female. And this starts from the very beginning. As soon as parents find out whether they're expecting a male or a female, they tend to purchase certain toys, decorate the baby's bedroom a certain color, and then either buy pink or blue clothes depending on the gender they're expecting. And it's not just about the clothing or the toys or the colors, it's also how parents interact with their children. So parents tend to be more gentle and have expectations of females being more gentle and calm, where males they may be a little rougher with, and they expect males to be rough and tough and rambunctious. So parents treat children according to the expectations they have for them. And it's difficult for children when they are trying to either move away from the gender that they have been assigned, or when they're trying to do things that don't conform with gender identity. So when a girl wants to wear boys' clothes as a child, or a boy wants to wear girls' clothes as a child, parents can be very alarmed by this. It goes against what they've conditioned, their brain has been conditioned to believe throughout their whole life, that girls are girls and boys are boys, and you're supposed to behave within the dichotomy of that identity. Then children get messages from their peers. In general, research shows that children tend to interact and play with kids of their own gender, and that they understand what gender is even as early as age 2. Children also develop gendered-typed ways of interacting. And so girls talk more, and their play tends to involve talking, oftentimes making characters or dolls talk to one another, where boys roughhouse more with one another. They play wrestle, and they also play with trucks and cars and other types of construction sort of toys. And so what happens is females are socialized at a very young age to learn how to talk and communicate more effectively than males, because that's the expectation, and that's the gendered play. We also have the media, which helps us determine what is male, what is female. School, up until recently, it was actually believed that men were better at spatial abilities, mentally manipulating shapes and images, than girls, and that girls were just better at communication, couldn't do the things like spatial judgments. But it's actually not true. It depends on how the child is raised. So it used to be that boys were taught to learn how to read a map before GPS, because boys typically do the driving and they find out how to get to where from A to B. And so females were typically uncomfortable or unfamiliar with reading maps and had a really hard time making their brain think that way as an adult, because they weren't raised to do that. And then there's also religion. And religion has very specific expectations oftentimes for men and women in the roles that they play within the religious institution. For example, almost everybody prays to a male god. In some religions, only men are able to be preachers, pastors, or priests. In some religions, only men can initiate a divorce. And in general, across all religions, women are oftentimes viewed as causes of sexual sin or sexless pure virgins. Makes this even more complicated. So how is sex determined? To figure that out, we have to go back to the womb, or start with the womb, I should say. And it's important to understand that sex of offspring is determined by the sperm. So each egg or sperm only carries one sex chromosome. Eggs carry an X, and sperm carries an X or a Y. So it is the sperm that determines whether or not the fetus will be male or female. If the sperm is carrying an X chromosome, then the result is a female. If the sperm is carrying a Y chromosome, the result is a male. But unfortunately, sometimes things can go wrong. So there can be chromosomal abnormalities, as discussed in your textbook. And there are 3 kinds that are talked about in your text. The first is a trisomy, and that occurs when a baby has, or fetus, has 3 copies of a chromosome instead of just 2. And this abnormality can bring on Down syndrome, where an individual has developmental disabilities. And then sometimes the baby or the fetus can develop Turner syndrome, which is the complete or partial absence of a second sex hormone. Some common characteristics for Turner syndrome. Children are typically very short. The average height is 4 foot 8 inches. Oh, the Turner syndrome only affects girls. I should have mentioned that. Many don't complete puberty. Only about a third actually grow any breast material. Girls with Turner syndrome have average intelligence. They don't have any developmental disabilities. But they may have problems with heart, kidney, thyroid issues, or celiac disease. For the most part, girls with Turner syndrome can lead full productive lives. And then there's Klinefelter syndrome. And this is when when a baby is born with too many X chromosomes. So oftentimes it can be like an XXY result. And this is when the Klinefelter syndrome affects boys. Some boys develop breast tissue. Most of boys with Klinefelter syndrome have smaller than average testicles, and they aren't able to produce sperm. And so, but just like with Turner syndrome, boys can lead full productive lives, independent. And so it's not something that needs to freak people out or worry when their baby is diagnosed this way. And then there is just transgender and transsexual. The issue where the anatomy of someone's body does not match the gender identity that they have developed or that they feel. And the difference between transgender and transsexual is transgender would be an individual that has either male or female sex organs but feels the opposite gender, like within their head. So you can think of it as a disconnect between what's between the legs and what's in the head. Transsexual is still a transgender, but it's somebody that actually takes steps to try to either change into the opposite gender or to at least change some of their characteristics. Sorry, just knocked the microphone over. I hope that didn't make a really loud noise. You may be more interested about transgender and want to know more about it. Oprah actually interviewed the first transgender supermodel. Her name is Leah, and there's a clip here if you click on there if you want to know more about that. And it's important to realize that gender identity is not the same as sexual orientation. And if you do watch that clip that I've posted with Oprah interviewing Leah T, you'll find that one of the questions that Oprah asks is about sexual orientation. So is Leah T attracted to males or females? And it's really critical that you guys get that those two things are not the same. So sexual orientation refers to people with whom we prefer to relate to sexually or intimately, where gender identity, again, is whether one feels male or female. And that's just not the same. They're very separate categories, and it's important that you understand that although they may interact, they are separate. And there's no scientific evidence suggesting that the lack of female characteristics for females or a lack of male characteristics for males indicates homosexuality. So there's no scientific evidence to prove that males that act feminine or females that act masculine are necessarily attracted to people of the same sex. It really just depends. It's believed research shows that anywhere from 1 in 10 to 1 in 15 people identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And sexual orientation, what we know now from research, is that it is believed to be determined by the age of 5. So children are actually aware of their sexual orientation, but oftentimes they're very confused because they're raised, if they are attracted to the same sex, because we are raised in a very heterosexist society where the expectation is that girls and boys will get married and have babies. And so it can be very confusing for a child if they are attracted to children of the same sex. And most times, children don't say anything until adolescence or even adulthood. And it can be a real internal struggle for children that do identify as being attracted to the same sex, or even bisexual and being attracted to both members of sex. Okay, so how do we define homosexuality? And you really probably haven't given this much thought, but it's actually a really important issue, and it can be confusing. Do you define it as being attracted to a person of the same sex? Or do you define it as actually having intercourse with someone of the same sex? Or do you define it as just engaging in some type of sexual behavior? So how do you define that? Does it just include attraction, or does it have to include some type of action? And then what about bisexuality? Same thing. So is it just attraction? Does it have to include some type of sexual behavior or actual intercourse? And then if you do base it on encounters, how many encounters does one need to be considered gay, lesbian, or bisexual? So is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Is there a number? Who determines that? It's one of the reasons that the research looking at homosexuality is sometimes misleading and confusing. You have to really pay attention to how the researchers define homosexuality. And the most important way to define it is actually through self-identification, so asking individuals to identify themselves. That's what matters. How do they see themselves? And giving them more than just two categories, homosexual or heterosexual, but actually allowing either individuals to write in their sexual orientation or giving them as many categories as have been identified through the research. If researchers don't agree on how homosexuality or bisexuality is defined, then how can society? So it actually can make it a very interesting and difficult conversation to have if you don't agree to how it's defined. And again, it's not really important how it's defined by researchers, but it's important to look at how individuals identify themselves. And that's the most politically correct way to handle the issue. Let me just go back to biological theories for a second. Another theory is that there's a hormonal imbalance, that the male or the female is not producing enough of the hormones, the sex hormones they need to be considered heterosexual. However, there's no support for this theory. Researchers have been trying for years, as have therapists, to cure homosexuality with hormone injections, and that just doesn't work. It's not a hormone issue. Some other theories about how sexual orientation develops, psychological and learning theories, but there's not as much empirical support for these theories, meaning when you do the research, it's not panning out, it's not proving to be true. One of the most common ones, of course, is the parenting theory, the weak or absent father and the strong or domineering mother. However, these characteristics also produce heterosexual children, and more heterosexual children than homosexual children. So that theory has not proven to be true. Then another idea of learning theories includes rewards and punishments. So if a child has an unpleasant experience with heterosexuality, say they're raped or sexually abused, that they become homosexual because they learn that the heterosexual experience is associated with bad things, and then the homosexual experience is more rewarding. They're able to get close to someone. However, research doesn't support this very much with humans and animals, and lesbian women are not any more likely than heterosexual women to have been raped. So a lot of people actually buy into this theory that it's something about females being abused. And I personally think that has a lot to do with how many females are sexually abused or assaulted. 1 in 3 women are sexually abused as children. 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted at some point in their life. So that's a lot of women. And so chances are of you knowing someone personally that's been sexually abused, the chances are very good. The chances of you knowing somebody that's been sexually abused and may identify as homosexual are also very good. But doesn't mean there's more women that have been sexually abused that are heterosexual than there are that are homosexual. And then another theory that has had absolutely no support from the research is that children learn how to be gay from having a gay or lesbian parent, but children of gay and lesbian parents are not any more likely to be gay and lesbian than children of heterosexual parents. And it's important to note that almost all gay and lesbian adults have heterosexual parents, so that theory does not pan out. When it comes to bisexuality and pansexuality, it is explained by a continuum view on sexual orientation, as I indicated earlier. Your textbook talks about the Kinsey study. So again, it's the idea of a line. So looking at a line instead of a dichotomy, which would be more about having like you either check over here or you check over here. So some people are attracted to members of both sexes, and that would be considered bisexual. And then others are pansexual, and they're attracted to not only both sexes, males and females, but also those that don't particularly identify with either gender. They're known as androgynous or genderqueer. And they're also attracted to transgender, transsexual individuals. The easiest way to remember the difference between the two is to think of bi as two, male and female, and pan as round, more well-rounded, attracted to more types. And unfortunately, bisexual and pansexual individuals are sometimes treated in a hostile manner by the gay community. They've been accused of just trying out gay and not daring to come out completely, and particularly in today's society where bisexuality is more acceptable than it ever has been before. However, it's not a choice, and every single medical and professional medical and psychological association in this country has indicated and supported that sexual orientation is not a choice, that there is a biological component. It is important to realize, as we close this lecture, that the majority of individuals that define themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender know their sexual identity and their gender identity as early as 5 to 7 years of age. So this means if you're a parent and you have children, your children may already know what their sexual orientation is, but they may not be comfortable coming clean to you about it if they've received messages in the home that indicate that the parents are not comfortable with that, or don't accept it, or it goes against their religious beliefs. But still, most parents, even if they react with shock and horror the first time their child comes out to them, which means revealing their sexual orientation, most parents agree later that they wish they had been more accepting and open when their child came out to them because of the pain that it caused in the relationship and sometimes the split. Sometimes parents will throw children out or just stop speaking with them altogether. The other important fact is that the most promising line of research in explaining how sexual orientation develops is with biological theories. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, every major psychological and medical professional organization in this country, and many around the world, agree that sexual orientation is not a choice. So it's important to remember that people don't choose to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, transgender, etc.